Good morning. This is December 12th, and I want to wish you happy holidays. We're going to take a break, and the next Ollie will be in January, on January 9th. So you go get a break, and I get a break, and we all get to celebrate. Um, it's always useful to take stock at the end of a year to see what might have changed in international affairs, which carries over until the following year, and there are always little bits and pieces here to say about that. But this year, I think it's different. I think this year, when historians will go back to record things, they will say that there were major changes in world affairs in 2022, and that in subsequent years, 23, 4, and so forth, those years will all be impacted and will have to contend with the changes that have taken place in the year. So let me try to highlight some of what has gone on in 23, which I think is of import. Gone on 22, which is of import, not just for the year we lived through, and I've talked about that in previous ollies, but rather what we're moving into and the baggage that is being carried into 23 based on this year. Now, the most obvious thing to start with, I suppose, is that however the so-called liberal international or liberal global order was limping through 22, it's pretty dead now that we've come to the end of 22. I think it's generally recognized that it's dead. So that's kind of a monumental change after some decades. And it means that everyone has to adjust to it. And everyone has to not only adjust to the decline of the US in world affairs, but also to the fact that the whole sort of structure that was built after the Second World War not only has frayed, but has largely collapsed in 2022. That's a serious matter because when something collapses, vacuums get created. And then the question is, how do the vacuums get filled? Now, one of the more interesting aspects of all of this is, and something which will carry on into 23, is that, of course, there have been, the major powers in the past few years. The obvious one, the United States, China, Russia. And if you want to go in terms of population, the largest countries in the world are China, India, US, Indonesia, and Pakistan, and just in terms of sheer population. But as I've mentioned before in lectures, that the African continent is growing exponentially, and that has to be taken into account. So what does one do with the idea that the previous order is now recognized as having collapsed? Now, the last people in some ways to recognize it is the United States, because on the one hand, we are back. That is to say, the horrible Trump years are over. Biden has re-engaged. The US is trying to exercise leadership of one kind or another. So it looks like the US is back and we have overcome the Trump years. But that isn't actually true. That is to say, yes, Biden has moved back into alliances with Western Europe, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And he is taking an interest in the rest of the world. I'll talk about that in a minute too. But it's not as if the US can recoup the years when it was the dominant global liberal power in the world that everybody had to contend with and address. That is to say, others have moved in. Now, for most of 22, we talked about China and its enhanced role in the world, which of course was true economically in terms of the Belt and Road investments all over the world and so forth. Then came COVID, right? And China seemed to be taking strong measures, right? Zero COVID and all the lockup, which has now unscrambled. And China seems in considerably more disarray than it was a few months ago. On the one hand, Xi has said, you know, we're in charge, I'm in charge forever onward. On the other hand, we can see by the demonstration, we can see by the backpedaling of how to handle COVID, that there are real troubles in China. Some of its own making, the two that I just mentioned. But in addition, the Chinese economy was the role model, even in the beginning of 22, of this huge country whose economic growth was huge, right? And that too has declined. I mean, the growth rate for this past year looks around 6%. Still might seem a lot. It might be less, but it's certainly not the 8, 9, 10, 12 what percent that China has been wallowing under for some, or celebrating for some years. But what has changed in the midst of the COVID reversals, in the midst of Xi being, you know, firmly in power with and having no opposition in the government, but now having some opposition in the streets, especially amongst the young population, is that China has, as of, I would say, almost yesterday, and Xi in particular, decided, well, we better play a different kind of role in the world. Because heretofore, China's economic influence has been huge. Its technological integration into the global technological environment and so forth had been huge. But China has played a relatively little role in world affairs in other parts of the world, other than sort of economic investments, right? So now, if you listened to the news last week, Xi all of a sudden is in Saudi Arabia trying to win friends and influence people. So that in some ways, China is emerging out of its shell as being somewhat self-contained in terms of its politics, while, you know, being very active economically around the world and saying, hey, we're around and we're going to play some role ourselves in world affairs. So now you have Russia, right? We don't need to rehearse what Russia is doing in the world right now. Then we have the US saying, oh, guys, we're back. Then we have China now emerging out of its cocoon. And I think Saudi Arabia is not going to be the last stop, and essentially saying, hey, you know, it's not just the United States and Russia. China is also going to play a role. So that is new, and I think that will move with some vigor into 2023. In addition to that, something else has happened in terms of filling the vacuums in world leadership, which is that middle range powers, which heretofore have been very quiet for some decades, are now emerging as saying, hey, we're going to play a role in world affairs too. Who does one have in mind? Turkey. All over the place in the Middle East, all over the place selling arms to the Russians. Iran, which has played a role, right, in the Middle East, and the Shiite competitor to the Sunnis, making all kinds of trouble in Iraq and other places. But now Iran is saying, no, we're going to play a bigger role out there. Namely, for example, we too can sell drones to Russia and take sides. So that one of the things that has emerged and has become clarified at the end of this year is that on the one hand, you have the big powers who are still scrambling for influence and control, but you now have some middle range powers getting into the game and participating. And that is not only somewhat new, but I think will expand in the 2023, but also impacts the Russians and the Americans, and for that matter, the Chinese, Because, for example, in international fora, some of these middle-range powers now are saying, no, actually, we're not going to throw our weight in favor of the United States that we historically did, and we even did in a good part of 22. We're going to go into neutral, which is one of the reasons why quite a few countries, middle-range countries, countries who imagine that they can play some role in the world, are not supporting the United States in the Ukraine, aren't necessarily supporting the Russians, or not very strongly, but rather are trying to get some leverage for themselves on issues by not taking sides in some of these major and bigger quarrels. So you already have sort of two new phenomena. One, China spreading its global political wings to parallel its previous economic wings. You have these middle-range countries saying, you know, woe's us, we can play a role too. And by playing a role in two ways. One, not supporting one side or the other in conflicts, number one. And number two, taking sides in terms of selling militarily useful hardware and participating in the arms trade globally and in many places internationally. So that's actually going to be interesting in 2023, how this all plays itself out. Now, I've left out two sort of middle-range countries that'd like to play a role. One is Pakistan, which currently is in total disarray. Pakistan, again, one of the 5 largest, most populous countries in the world, A, because of the horrible floods, and B, because of its political disarray. And the other, interestingly enough, is Indonesia, which once upon a time, many of you are old enough to remember Sukarno, who was the dictator of Indonesia, who sought to play a role as in the non-aligned group during the early days of the Cold War. But then Indonesia went very quiet internationally. And right now, funny things are happening in Indonesia. For those of you who pay attention to the news, Indonesia has just passed a law saying any sex out of wedlock is illegal and punishable. Now that's weird, right? And second of all, criticism of the president can be punished. Now the president of Indonesia right now is this mild-mannered person who used to sell furniture, who is considered to be, you know, sort of moderate. Is he really going to charge people with objecting to him? So what is that all about? Well, without laying out the complexity of all the things that is all about, one of the things is that Indonesia, like other Muslim countries, are coping with and addressing the radicalization of Islam. Because you may recall that Indonesia is the most populous Islamic country in the world. It's not any country in the Middle East or in Africa, it's Indonesia, right? And the Indonesian conservative Muslims are rearing their heads in terms of Indonesian politics, and we better expect more involvement of Indonesia, or at least the right wing and the conservative religious aspects of Indonesia in world affairs in 2020 and 2023. Now, another dimension of 2023 has been the reorganization, maybe organization is too strong a word, but the alliance with the European Union. And that has been holding together, and the US has been participating. And you know that Macron was here about a week ago, said very positive things about US, French and European alliance. So the Europeans have, you know, reason to decide that they better stick together, and that they better stick together with alliances with the US given the not only the Ukrainian situation, but the spill-offs of the Ukrainian situation and the energy situation that the Russian-Ukrainian conflict has generated in Europe. So in that sense, the United States-European alliance has been strengthened in 2022, and we can expect that it will continue to be pretty much adherent to that let's stick together, even though there may be political differences that have emerged, both in terms of energy and environment and so forth, that they will try to paper over as much as possible, because structurally and politically, it's sort of what's left of the liberal political order in the world, and these guys better continue to get together. Now, one of the things that is just happening in the waning days of 2022, which also has its implication, is that finally the US has gotten around to recognizing that they can't just keep sidelining Africa. You may know that there's a conference of most African states right now in Washington, D.C., and Biden administration has made noises of having African countries join the group of 20, the G20, which is an economic grouping. That's new, and that will probably re-emerge as a not only talking point, an action point in 2023. And what has brought all of that about? Well, Russia, the United States, China are all very busy in Africa. China is very busy building, continued building roads and bridges. Russia is very busy selling arms to Africa. Many of the countries of West Africa and other parts of Africa that have domestic guerrilla movements and conflicts and jihadists are armed by the Russians. And so the Chinese are playing one role, the Russians are playing another role. What has been the US role in the last few years, including this past year? Well, actually, we've given a fair amount of development assistance of one kind or another. But that's sort of diffuse and not sort of politically very obvious and recognizable. What has been recognizable is that African countries are struggling, among other things, with COVID, and the fact that they have not gotten the permission to produce the vaccinations on the African continent so they can vaccinate. That's a high agenda item for Africa. We are saying, well, the pharmaceutical companies, have rights here. And they're saying, yes, but we need to have, the ability to produce vaccinations ourselves so we can safeguard ourselves. Africans are very well aware of the fact that they are not only the victims of climate change, but climate change has wreaked havoc in this last year in the Horn of Africa and some other places. People in the Horn of Africa, we've talked about this, are starving as we speak. And at the same time, they're well aware of the fact that the continent has resources, natural resources, for example, minerals that everybody needs for their chips and computers, as well as environmental resources, namely forests and tropical rainforests, that if indeed they are cut down in the Congo and other places, global climate change will take place even more rapidly, and it can't be slowed down. So African leaders are saying to themselves, correctly, I believe, we have some leverage now. And the US is saying, we better exercise some leverage on the African continent, because otherwise we're leaving the show to essentially the Chinese and the Russians, and to some extent the Iranians and the Turks and so forth, that are also selling, drones and arms and onward. So this Africa has been, 22 was very much sidelined in terms of American policy, in terms of American interests. And of course, from the Europeans' perspective, there's the colonial overhang. And Russia and China have been very busy in Africa, as have others. So belatedly, after 2 years, the Biden administration is tumbling to the idea that Africa needs to be taken more seriously, not just out of some kind of charitable generosity, but rather because it's absolutely central to questions of climate change, to questions of, leverage, political, economic, and other kinds of leverage, the vacuums which have been filled by countries other than the United States. So it will be interesting to see this week to what extent, promises will be made to the African continent. But it's interesting that for the first time in decades, really, African leaders are coming to the United States, having some leverage and saying, hey guys, we exist too. We will, be 40% of the population by the end of the continent if our population doesn't slow down. There is no way you all can address climate change without putting us in the picture. And, if you want to stop Russian and Chinese and other people's influence militarily and in terms of arms, and supporting various jihadist movement, you better get on board and get on top of this. That is actually a really interesting development, and 2023 will be the time when this will all have to play itself out. So, climate, COVID, religion, arms, all have been on the front burner, but all have undergone changes in the degree to which the US and other countries better reorient themselves and address them based on the changes that already took place in 2022 and figure out what to do with any and all of this. The Middle East is, a mess. And I will talk about that in the new year. But you can see that what's transpiring in Israel is by anybody who's interested in, I don't know, help to the Palestinians or resolution of the conflict or democracy or anything else, is about to become a nightmare under the Netanyahu regime, with all kinds of extreme right-wingers being in the cabinet, etc. So that is a mess. The desire of Saudi Arabia to play a bigger role is of interest. The Emirates and so on that we've been watching in soccer need to be addressed. So even the Middle East has to make it back to the front burner, not just for the United States, but for Europe in general. One of the things that is worth talking about for a few minutes is that, of course, the global liberal order was also based on the global institutional order that developed after the Second World War. What do I have in mind? Well, I have in mind not just the UN in New York, but all the specialized agencies which are meant to address, climate and food and refugees and all of those things. And all of them have been sort of become somewhat obscure and functioning under the radar screen, and in some senses outdated. And so that has become very obvious in 2022, in spite of the Secretary General of the UN trying very hard to, have at least the UN in New York have 2 cents worth on the Ukrainian-Russian situation. But basically, one hasn't heard much about what these agencies are doing, and many of them are not functioning very well. So one of the things that presumably has to move onto the front burner in 2023 is either to say, well, this whole structure is no longer functioning and we need to reform it and radically reform it to address this part of the century, and or we don't want to reform it, and we might as well kill off some of these agencies and develop new parallel ones that might be functioning somewhat better. This is not a minor issue, and it's become a major issue not just in economic and social matters, but also, for example, in human rights matters. You might have been reading about the fact that human rights groups are now saying a special court has to be set up to deal with war crimes in the Ukraine, Russian war crimes in Ukraine. Because the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice can't really handle this situation for a variety of, structural and historical reasons. So the fact that even the mechanisms for developing meaningful judicial functions on a global scale are not really fit for this 2023, and it will be interesting. That has now been recognized, but it will be interesting to see to what extent the recognition will lead to some serious folks putting heads together and saying a criminal court, a human rights court, needs to address these war crimes that are taking place, that for a variety of reasons we can talk about next year, are not either suitable or don't have the purview to handle these matters. So we're talking about international economic institutions, development institutions, social institutions, monitoring institutions, legal institutions, all of which have become obviously dysfunctional in part or wholly in 2022 to address 2022 issues, which are war, human rights, refugee crisis, climate change, that whole agenda, which has been in one way or another highlighted in 2022, but the capability of taking action has not moved very far off. The needle has not moved very far. And so something needs to be done about this. What can be done about it and how many countries will participate, how much the existing liberal democracies of Europe and the United States and Canada and so forth can weigh in effectively and convince Africa, Latin America, other parts of the world that they need to participate is still an open question. So we need to watch and see. But certainly the dial has moved in 2022 on the urgency of readdressing all these various matters. So what seems to be sort of a system sort of lumbering along in 2022 has now reached pretty much a cracking point for 2023. And it'll be interesting to watch and to talk about how 2023 actors will be addressing these. And that raises interesting questions as to whether or not powers that I talked about, like middle powers, or even a large country like India, which also has not been super active in international affairs, will put shoulder to the wheel and saying, hey guys, we're players here too, and we have ideas, and we're going to participate. Now, from an American and European perspective, of course, that reduces the power or the leverage of a country like the United States. On the other hand, it may be a way of addressing the very dire issues that need to be addressed, climate change perhaps being on top, but the movement of people also being a high point. And finally, I want to just raise the question of the movement of people, migration, and refugees one more time. The US is in a total mess about this. The Biden administration seemingly is continuing some policies of the Trump administration. All countries are wrestling with the diversity of cultures and languages that people who come out from outside their countries and cultures are producing. And the fact that this is no longer something that can be swept under the rug has become obvious in 22 when so many countries elected right-wing politicians, whether it's in Scandinavia, France, elsewhere. The right has increased, the left has, the populists have increased. The number of people in a country like the United States and England willing to support right-wing causes has increased. And people are clearly unhappy and clearly wanting to blame, migrants, refugees, changing of cultures. Largely, 2022 has been treading water on this issue, and I think 2023 will have to address some of it head on. And let me just add or end on this particular point by saying that most European countries, many Asian countries, including China and the United States, will have in the rest of the century a shortage of manpower and labor power. Right-wing people in the United States may scream that we're allowing too many people in, but we have a million plus shortage of workers in the United States. And part of that has to do with people leaving the labor force, aging out of the labor force. This is on the agenda for the next 10 years, but it's beginning to have to be addressed in countries that have serious labor shortages, serious aging population shortages. And while on the one hand, one keeps talking about the US and Europe in this regard, the problem is huge in Japan, the problem is huge in South Korea, and the problem in the next few years will become huge in China. So that is also on the agenda for 2023. Ironically, sort of a funny side note, we've been watching the soccer matches in all those countries in the Gulf, and some of them have populations of a couple of million people or something. In most of those countries, the majority of the population are not permanent immigrants, but rather guest workers from other countries. In Doha and elsewhere, you have, Indians building all the buildings, you have Filipinos working in every household, you have Africans here, there, and yonder doing different things. We, in fact, are in the middle of a huge population movement, not necessarily permanent to immigrate, although that's also the case, but rather the movement of people. For those of you who might be taking, trips over Christmas, or you might notice that, for example, on cruise ships, almost everybody comes from Southeast Asia, sometimes from East Europe. All of them are workers who work around the clock for months on end to send money home. So the shifts in population, which we tend to discuss in the US in terms of immigrants, are in fact happening in terms of temporary workers. And finally, let me say, one of the big problems of our tech industry that divesting themselves of workers, many of them who are on visas, H1 whatever visas, which they will lose unless they find another tech job very quickly, are the sort of potential crisis in the making in the US and other countries, because these folks from India, wherever, have lived in the US for years, their children are born and gone to school here, and all of a sudden, Facebook or Google says, well, we're terminating your employment. This too is a mess that is about to confront the US and some other countries. So let's not forget the people involved as we think about Christmas and our other holidays. We're not just talking economics and abstract politics. We're also talking about huge population shifts, which have already started, but which will accelerate in 2023. Anyway, in January, we'll get back to more specific issues, Latin America and elsewhere. In the meantime, have a good holiday.